morning. To pick up right where Mike left off a moment ago, historical artifacts are one thing, and most of these date just from 100 or so years old. But if I had to ask you as far as your own doctor's access of who you might know, can I see a show of hands a moment? Who knows more than 3 doctors who are accessible to you or a patient right next to you who could actually authorize you to get cannabis today? Can I have a show of hands a minute? Who's able to? Okay, there's about a dozen hands that went up out of a room that may have 200, 250 people potentially. That's a big message. And my awareness of this dates back to last year in August when this political cartoon came up. So it's a gem for me because it screamed out something about really where the dilemma is. And it has to do with, first and foremost, education. Because this poor doctor here represents where I come from, about 90 minutes down the road in Miami. Welcome to Florida, everybody. We do it different here, and this sort of evidence is that. In this case, a doctor speaks to a patient about a situation that was heralded in Florida in particular within the last decade or so with OxyContin pill mills, and brings up in a way that looks actually kind of bored and certainly not particularly educated with what's being said, professing to a patient that this is the way it is. So there is a problem with that, and I promise you, as sad as that may look, doctors in the Florida Medical Association, of which I'm a member, are not uncompassionate as that may look. And in fact, in a current mantra of compassionate care, that absolutely has taken the next step in a transition from children and neurological disorders to patients representing patients out of time, vets, PTSD as a compassionate care mantra. It's been a very effective message, and I'm happy to extend it to you with here today because it predates these artifacts, really predates it. It goes back before, in fact, before written time. It goes way back in an ethnobotanical sense, and that's what I'd like to share with you this morning, a few understandings about just how far back this goes. The theme for this conference, I believe the 21st year, in the 21st century is appropriate, celebrating the past and embracing the future. That's why Mike and I are paired together here for you this morning. But the past is an ancient past. And if you can see from a slide like this, the nutritional plant wisdom was taught across generations. Eastern cultures, they respect, relish their elders to share this information with them. And if you can't tell your kids what they need to do to stay healthy, you're not doing your job. So in fact, this goes way back. We still teach it, but in limited ways, and we still teach students not just what to do, but right from wrong from historical sense, because you have to go back not to ancient prehistoric times, but to Hippocrates, the father of Western medicine, we call Hippocrates, who basically said that natural forces within us are the true healers of disease. This slide is from just 2 weeks ago, and I'm privileged to give the oath of medicine to the University of Miami's graduating medical students, 185 every year. So the teaching of medicine across generations you might think is just starting in modern times, but its roots go far deeper. So what I'd like to do is show you just really how deep this goes. And so the title of the talk really is Insight into the Past, but it's a distant past. And of course, the present and where we may be going into the future. So in fact, those slides are kind of representative of a distant past, because if you think that the endocannabinoid system started with us as human beings in the 1930s, you're wrong. Okay, the issue starts well before that. Primates use plants for therapy. But not only primates, we'll have a speaker later on who will talk to you about how invertebrates, even before vertebrates, ancient mechanisms that are within us still to date that we're just discovering that have been part of our very essence. So where did it really first start, at least for cannabis then? Pleistocene, refugia. This is a time during the Ice Age when Neanderthals existed alongside with Cro-Magnon that we evolved from. And in ancient times, in very few places in the world, plants derived here And this little red area here on the slide shows one red area as a refugee. There's another up in the corner here, closer to where Europe would be. This is the Holy Grail. This is where those people from the hippie backpack trails back in the early 70s went to look for those vestigial seeds that might still be somehow represented there, and I've heard people say that they're like dodo birds, dead, they don't exist anymore. But the current genetics actually does have these older recessive genes that are hidden in a way that they're still secrets that are yet to be found. Those secrets were recognized by prehistoric peoples. So much so that even the picture on the bottom right there of a burial scene was things that are now thousands and thousands of years later being unearthed to show the significance of how plants and people evolved together. So where did it actually go from there historically? Well, it moved largely around Asia, found its ways in not only drug form, but textile forms and different forms that when you go back are kind of hard to discern, but nevertheless, the pathways of how it extended not just around this continent, but through the entire world, we carried them. And that just begs a question of who's really bringing who where. How smart is a plant if it can't walk from here to there to escape natural stresses? How smart is it for that plant to find a way that it'll have vehicles to carry it? And I'm not talking about a fruiting tree that drops a fruit and an animal picks it up, eats it, and then poops it out someplace else. I'm talking about us. We've been the ones who've largely carried this around the whole globe. So yet its roots being in Asia, through China, India, the yin-yang system of what promotes good health, qi, the flow through our bodies, has been recognized for thousands and thousands of years. And to the same extent with India and Ayurveda. These are Eastern concepts. Western medicine is a bit different though, but through the East, you had in ancient times, even in Egypt, Imhotep, along with Hippocrates, regarded as two of the key principal figures in medicine to organize, write down, and pass along the secrets, and a lot of those secrets were derived in plants. So I'm speaking to you actually as a board-certified anesthesiologist. I know something about pharmacology, I know something about patient care, how drugs work with people's physiology, but before I was ever interested in medicine in people, I knew something about plants. I'm a plantsman. How about in the audience here? Because this is an incredibly varied group. I see doctors, I know several MDs of you here. I know there's people who are growers who like to grow. I know there's people who are patients or representing patients. This is an incredibly varied audience. So of the people here who I might have some roots to, who are actually people who are growers here? Can I try a show of hands here? Again, a good 15 or 20. And in addition to growing then, what about MDs, doctors, DOs, people in healthcare, healers? Who would classify yourself as a healer? Again, about twice as many. That's a wonderful representation of healers. Because if you saw in that first slide, what's lacking is really an education that healers get, especially MDs, DOs, and many states, doctors that are actually authorized to provide this for patients. And the fact is that I don't necessarily fault those doctors themselves, but we're the victims of prohibition because at least in our country now we've had 2 full generations of doctors, he didn't have to worry about this, who have been taught that it has no accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse, neither of which we understand today. So getting that message across, it's harder to unlearn what you've been taught. So as far as plants go, and really an area where I thought this talk could find a different sense of where my roots might contribute a little different perspective, this to me is my way of saying that there's a need to reintegrate what is otherwise a classical botanical medicine, and that's the way we nurture our nature. And we do it by looking at what's similar. And I remember seeing this slide when I started in medical school. It was scary to me, because I knew what chlorophyll looked like before what's called hemoglobin. And those of you who are growers out there would know that if you have a plant that's sick and you want to push it so it can go and overcome a stress, you give it magnesium, don't you? That's what good farmers know. You can give it almost in abundance. A little extra is not going to hurt you. Doctors do the same thing with patients by giving extra iron. Women who are in childbearing times have to make sure that their iron has a full complement, so hemoglobin will work to its efficiency. So when you look side by side, and this is a molecular deep root of just how similar the plant's life force of chlorophyll is, right next to where you see hemoglobin, that's our life force, you can't live without it, it's blood. This is a scary similarity to me, but one that just screams out how similar we are and how our roots go back to the very plants we're talking about. So what's special about the plants? I've heard several people already speak, even just this morning, as short as the conference has been, on the importance of balances of chemicals. Well, nature always seeks a balance. And that balance, at least in not maybe the current strains that you might see of cannabis, but vestigial strains, most likely represented a balance between, at least in this case, the principal elements of THC and CBD. And so, in fact, that's what you see in the middle. That's what you see, that balance that's so important to find in order so that we have that idea of how do we, in fact, nurture one's own nature. So there's somebody who said this much more eloquently than I could about the importance of keeping those very chemicals together. And those of you who may know who said this quote, just take with me a moment and read this. Isolating an active constituent from a plant is an affront to nature. It's like taking the intelligence and leaving the wisdom behind. I couldn't say that any better, so I had to quote Deepak. So there have been people who have not just known this, but have finally brought this to light. And of course, it's recent history. This is just 50 years ago, folks. And so if in this time we now have the scientific evidence to just show not simply how similar we are, but in summary, the importance of how all of these chemicals combine together, again, going back to Eastern roots of how medicine evolved with human beings, this is the start of it. And so you say, well, wait a minute, the THC, it's dangerous, so it makes you, not really be productive or forget things. Well, guess what? Forgetting can actually be pretty helpful. Now, I'm not talking about forgetting where you left your keys for the 10th time that month, but I'm talking about why is it important to talk about forgetting. And my undergraduate degree in chemistry was in case I got into medical school, and I did, but I had a minor in psychology, and 35 years ago, I was thinking just about this kind of thing. Why is it important to forget from a very primitive sense, how we're made the way we are? And so one of the things I want to share with you is the importance, in this case, you can liken this to PTSD if you want, but as far as a vestigial root, why are these chemicals, these molecules in us? I'm not talking about the plant. Why are we made this way? And I write here that fear is the ability to forget. It's an ability. And it's a survival strength. And I want to take you for a little story here in a moment, because I don't know how many of you are from Florida, but let's go back 5,000, 10,000 years, and let's take a walk outside a minute, all right? We're walking around, and we're doing our thing to find a squirrel or kill a fish just to live and get through the day. And out of nowhere, a wild hog or a beast like that. Mind you, that's Stone Age, so pardon the Disney-esque slide of showing a cave. There are no caves in Florida like that. But let's say we're walking around and out of nowhere comes a beast, a wild boar, but a prehistoric one, like the size of a Buick. And we're scared to death. We're running from it. We're finding a tree. We scamper up that tree. And the next thing you know, they're snorting, our hearts are pounding, our adrenaline is surging. We're staying up there because that wild boar, it's waiting for us to come down, fall down, and it'll be back in the morning because it's got to go at night or something's going to come along and eat it. It's not a nocturnal creature, so we're stuck up in the tree. Now, what if we couldn't get that sheer fear, terror, the moment of that stress out of our minds? How are we going to fall asleep? How are we going to recover physically, mentally, and have the energy we need so that at sunrise before that beast comes back, we're out of there on our way to have another productive day and look for something we didn't get to eat when the beast circumvented us from the day before? That's probably why we have this in us, so we can forget the moment to get on with those things that are so important in life. So forgetting can be very helpful, genetically favorable, and so for that reason, these chemicals have stayed within us for all time. So they don't only affect pain and fear, they actually also affect what could be pleasure. And this is another example of where I want to share with you how healthy people look in fact at pain to pleasure in a Freudian sort of continuum, to where imagine if you couldn't forget those extreme fears of pain. I'm not just talking about the beast hunting. What about women having babies? If women could not forget extremes of pain, we'd probably have no need in our language for the word brother or sister. Nobody'd have a brother or sister. We'd all be only children. And on the other side of the equation, for pleasure things, imagine what would have happened if someone couldn't escape the moment of pleasure and caveman Og decides he doesn't want to pay any attention other tending to Mrs. Paleolith's needs at that time, and they're so into it that they don't realize that the saber-toothed tiger behind them is just going to catch them out of the element. How long do you think that kind of behavior is going to stay in a genetic pool? Tiger wins every time. So there's probably a healthy balance where forgetting extremes of pleasure or pain are where we live. And how we adapt to those are probably germane to the why each and every one of us in this room are different. Our life experiences bring different efforts on how we as individuals choose to forget, biologically choose to forget, extremes that make us who we are. Your tolerance is different than yours and mine, and this is probably how we all manage to exist in a healthy way. And it's absolutely something that is a receptor system within us. And the fact that it's a receptor system within us, to me, makes perfect sense, and it fit into a paradigm that I knew when I'm training as a young anesthesiologist, which predates the dates of the discovery of the endocannabinoid receptor system, because that's my whole background. Anesthesiologists know how drugs work through receptors in our body, and I was fortunate. I practiced through the heyday of receptor-specific pharmacology. Pharmaceutical companies would come out every few years, a patent expires, here's another one. It's a little tweak on an existing receptor. Here's the new molecule, let's deal with that, until a patent goes. So this is receptor system things that, to me, were always the way they were. If you want to look at those receptors, though, as far as what we have in us, of course, the receptors we have can be broken down CB1, CB2. And I'd like you to look at this slide where, to me, this just screams out past meets future. One of the things I like to do now at this stage of my career is I look at Eastern medicine. I actually take acupuncture courses through the University of Miami. And I came across this picture on the left versus the picture on the right there. The picture on the right are CB2 receptors. They're lighting up all over the body, but let's just say that those red hot colors, not just where the liver spleen is, but up around the spinal column, most of them concentrated in greatest densities in the abdominal area, down here in your belly. That's what many people consider to be your second brain. This is where your body's immune system lives. This is where your general health, your ability to recover, those things that determine how we're wired, that's where they exist. If you look at the picture on the left of the acupuncture area, and you look at the density of where acupuncture points are, you'll see the greatest density in the abdomen. That's an ancient picture. So in fact, the picture on the right happens when you take some cannabinoids, radioactively isotope label them, inject them, and then see where they settle out a couple hours after they go in. This is where those receptors are. This is East meets West. Old science that they may not have known, as was mentioned before, meets new science with the evidence to support it. So all these different chemicals then, and it's not just THC and CBD. The future may exist, in fact, in those combinations that we were talking about before that absolutely figure into how this all comes together with multiple chemicals. And the future from there really branches right next to genetics. That's the 21st century. When I talk to medical students now, we talk about the past, the present, and then the future, just the same theme of this meeting. And I try to explain to new docs, I say the future is really going to be in genetics, but they don't understand that if that's all I tell them. So I start from where we are, and I say, hey guys, if you don't know where you came from, how do you think you can possibly know where you are now? And if you don't know where you are now, how do you think you can find the fastest, most efficient way, and that's the secret, to get to where you want to go? You have to know where you came from in order to know where you are and know where to go forward in the most efficient way. So the other drugs that we've talked about before, Sativex, it's really the first one out there. It's the combination. Whether or not it winds out surviving, it's at least the single foot in the door, as far as a pharmaceutical, in the pharmaceutical industry, foot in the door of federal prohibition. And the cost to patients, that's another issue. That will work itself out. But things like that, things like psyche, delivery mechanisms, 21st century and beyond delivery systems of precision is what heretofore has been lacking with cannabis as a general rule. So with all of that background, I want to try to conclude with saying, so where do you go from here? When you get stuck, what do you do when you have certain rules, guidelines, legal, ethical discussions? That's, I think, where most of the problems as far as advancing this subject lie, legal, ethical things. If there's anything I'd like you to pick out of this talk here now over the last several minutes about the biological, the botanical roots that we really have, it's just that. Cannabis fits into a different paradigm. It's a biological, botanical, you can call it a drug, it's a plant, the drugs are derived from there, but in fact, if you're stuck with a legal, ethical paradigm that says that you approach things according to the way even the AMA today says, according to its code of ethics, that a physician shall respect the law and also recognize responsibility to seek changes in those requirements which are contrary to the best interests of patients. That's speaking purely to the message of a medical, legal, ethical viewpoint. But this is different. This transcends it. This is biological. So it deserves not, in my opinion, a medical ethical viewpoint, but a bioethical viewpoint. Bioethics are a science. And in fact, the bioethics, in fact, now are probably more important to this discussion than perhaps the legal ethics. And so, in fact, here is a statement that we're working on. If any of you have an interest in the bioethical ways to say something, realize that ethical statements very often derive from making a statement that is simply irrefutable. And any of you out there would like to speak with myself or Michael during the break about what Michael does, I'm looking for input, contributions, because these are works in progress. As the science evolves, the ethics evolves. The ethics and the proactive education to derive the science, that science will dictate what those ethics should be and the laws that follow. And so from that background, I'll invite you after the break. I think we got some coffee now. Share some of this with me, and I appreciate your time.